I do not aim with my hand. He who aims with his hand has forgotten the face of his father. I aim with my eye. I do not shoot with my hand. He who shoots with his hand has forgotten the face of his father. I shoot with my mind. I do not kill with my gun. He who kills with his gun has forgotten the face of his father. I kill with my heart. Stephen King, The Gunslinger Credo. There are no explanations for human evil, only excuses. Dean Koontz, Intensity. Hi, hello, and welcome again everybody to another episode of Natural Juan. This time around we're going to discuss two world-famous American authors who are known for writing some truly scary stories and comparing them as thoroughly as I can. While I've made videos about It and Phantoms, now it's time to discuss the writers who wrote them, Stephen King and Dean Koontz respectively. Anyway, before I go on, here's a quick shout out to Mr. Jonathan Green, my patron in Patreon. If you would also like to support my channel and what I do here, feel free to check my PayPal, Patreon, and PayPal information in the description below. Also, be sure to hit subscribe and the bell icon so you'll be able to see more videos like this. There will also be a few announcements at the end of this video, so you might want to stick around for that as well. Now, with all that out of the way, let's get to know Stephen King and Dean Koontz a little bit more, and the differences between them. Stephen King, born as Stephen Edwin King, came from Portland, Maine, with his date of birth being September 21, 1947. He and his mother, Nellie Ruth King, moved in with his father, Donald Edwin King, to Chicago at least for a while before moving on to Croton-on-Hudson, New York. Stephen King's family then moved to Scarborough, Maine, where his parents were originally married by the end of World War II. Stephen King's skills as a writer could be glimpsed even when he was just a child of 6 or 7, as even then he began copying story ideas off of comic books that he read. He also makes mention that in his days as a child, any stories he might have written then were more or less thought of as movies, as that was all he knew at the time. That said, most of his works tend to be a hit and miss when it comes to films, with some being classics and others not so classic. Nonetheless, Stephen King's writing is legendary in that he tends to write stories and novels rather quickly, with most of them being of good quality despite the speed they're created. Stephen King himself states that most or even all of his stories do not come from him, but are instead things his mind digs up, similar how to paleontologists manage to uncover the remains of dinosaurs and other prehistoric creatures. In fact, according to On Writing, one of his books that details the art of writing, he claims that it is not in fact the duty of an author to get their main characters out of trouble, but simply to observe and write down the events that take place. Dean Koontz, on the other hand, is an author born on July 9, 1945 in Everett, Pennsylvania. He is the son of Florence and Raymond Koontz and grew up in an abusive household. His rough experience early on in life would shape much of how he would write many of his stories later on in his career. He mostly wrote science fiction in his early days, with his most pronounced one being Star Quest in 1958. Dean Koontz is a devout Catholic, much like J.R.R. Tolkien, creator of Lord of the Rings, and this is readily apparent in a lot of his works. It should be noted, however, that while Dean Koontz leans heavily on the more conservative side of things of American history and is very spiritual in his writing, he still seems wary of governments and organized religion in general. Dean Koontz is also a very prolific writer, much like Stephen King, and the two are often compared. However, Koontz writing tends to be more optimistic in theme and style, with many of his protagonists maintaining a positive outlook despite the horrors they are facing. It should also be mentioned that a lot of the evil that takes place in Dean Koontz's stories are due to a lack of morality in society and people, instead of rather than just being random coincidence. Dean Koontz's writing, while comparable to King's, is indeed similar, but is the polar opposite in terms of their themes. For instance, while not stated by Dean Koontz himself, some of his characters tend to get by through luck, which is provided by the author himself. Instances of these include knocking unconscious an armed guard, providing them with weapons, or happening upon a cache of useful tools when in dire straits. Now, I've already stated that themes are one of the major differences between the two authors, with Stephen King's stories leaning towards the more cynical, with Dean Koontz's being a bit more upbeat. That said, there are still a lot of fans who want the two writers to collaborate on a future novel or story, but this is highly unlikely, and not just because of their political leanings. As already mentioned, Dean Koontz is a writer who believes that an author must also provide his characters with some sort of aid or help in their darkest hour, while Stephen King prefers that characters find their own way. To the latter, it doesn't matter if the characters in question die. He believes an author should only watch and write and nothing else. Another major difference between the two authors is their content. Stephen King is often classed as a horror and fantasy writer. Sure, he writes stories with fairly mundane elements in them, but these are often horrific in the sense that there are truly monstrous people in the world and are real enough to make me uncomfortable. He also writes fantasy such as Eyes of the Dragon and fairy tale, but these are tied to his Dark Tower mythos in one way or another. More often than not, Stephen King's stories and monsters are based on fantasy or mystical ideas, even if they are terrifying. Dean Koontz, on the other hand, leans towards being a writer of suspense thrillers. Most of his works are fairly mundane with the occasional otherworldly element. Sure, he does have stories like Winter Moon and Darkfall, but these are a rarity. More often than not, Dean Koontz's stories and monsters can actually be explained by science, as is the case with the ancient enemy of phantoms and the pogromites of 77 Shadow Street. While certainly outlandish and unlikely, the monsters contained therein are still plausible, even if they are truly horrific creatures. Indeed, one good comparison is that Stephen King's works are more like DC Comics, with supernatural beings and often dark themes, while Dean Koontz's writing have more in common with Marvel Comics, with his creatures being based more on advanced science and has more upbeat storytelling. It's very ironic then, at least to me anyway, that it was Marvel Comics that made Stephen King's work a comic adaptation based on his Dark Tower novels. Whatever the case, and whichever author you like, you're always free to choose which books you'll want to read. Still, I'd encourage you all to give both a try, so you can decide which is better. It's not for me to judge, after all, which stories you prefer and which ones you don't. Anyway, that's it for this particular episode, and it's time to move on to the announcements I mentioned earlier. So I've been making videos on YouTube for quite a long time now. There are two things I've been thinking about, and one is about making a webcomic about mature or dark superhero stories, and the other is about the SCP Foundation, which I've also come to enjoy. I am inspired by Eric D. July, better known by his YouTube handle, Young Rippa, and his creation of his own brand of comics called Rippaverse, but the thing is, I don't really have the resources to create such a thing. SCPs are interesting as well, but there are already a lot of other YouTubers working on them, including the Exploring series, whom I've come to really enjoy, and I really recommend him to you guys. And there's also the fact that SCP videos are starting to lose their appeal to the public. My solution? Well, I've decided to create a series of videos entitled Anomalous Artifacts Agency, or AAA, or even AAA for short. In a nutshell, the AAA is like a combination of the SCP Foundation, Marvel Comics' SHIELD, and, of course, the Men in Black from the MIB films. These videos will detail the various objects, heroes, villains, and otherworldly monsters that will be populating my work, so that even if I don't have a comics company to make something like Rippaverse, you'll at least be able to see me world building something. Okay, so if you have any comments or reactions, either about this update or my take on the two authors mentioned above, my comment section is open and waiting for you down below. Natural Juan